Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1972 Spanish-Portuguese horror film, Tombs of the Blind Dead, or technically I think the original Spanish title translates to The Night of Blind Terror, but the film is more commonly known as Tombs of the Blind Dead, or simply The Blind Dead. The movie has also been released in some places under the title Revenge from Planet Ape, but I'll explain later on why the film had this rather perplexing alternate title. Now, Tombs of the Blind Dead was written and directed by Amando de Ossorio, if I'm saying his name right, and it's often credited as the film that sort of kicked off the Spanish horror boom of the 1970s. Now, what the plot of Tombs of the Blind Dead is we follow these two friends named Betty and Victoria, who are roommates in college and also had a sexual relationship with each other. They run into each other at a hotel resort while they're both on vacation, and Victoria introduces Betty to her friend Roger. While on a train ride, Betty and Roger take a liking to each other, which causes Victoria to become jealous because it turns out she still has feelings for Betty, so she ends up taking her luggage and hopping off the train, and she camps out at these old ruins. That night while she's there, these vampire-like zombies rise from their graves and attack her and ultimately kill her. The next day, Betty and Roger hear about this and they try to investigate into her murder, obviously having no way of knowing what actually happened to her. And eventually they learn about this medieval legend of these Templar knights who were excommunicated from the church for worshiping the devil, and it turns out that they sacrificed young women to Satan in order to achieve immortality, and now all these hundreds of years later they return from their graves as revenants to punish anybody who trespasses on their tombs. And Betty and Roger learn that the legend is true. Now, Tombs of the Blind Dead is a very effective early 70s horror film and is genuinely pretty creepy at times. Now, admittedly, it's one of those movies where the plot is almost secondary to the general tone and mood and atmosphere that the movie creates, and this movie just oozes atmosphere. Especially the scenes where the blind dead are riding on their horses. It's played in slow motion, creating this eerie, dreamlike quality, and the blind dead themselves are actually pretty creepy villains. Sure, the idea of blind zombies might seem inherently silly, but you realize that these things track you by sound. Like, they can hear your heartbeat, and they can hear your every footstep, and they can hear you breathing, so if you're on their territory, you're pretty much fucked. Also, they are clearly guided by some kind of a higher power, be that Satan or some kind of an evil god or force. And the blind dead have this almost monk-like chant, which sounds like a mix between prayers and moaning, and again, it's genuinely really creepy. Now, the movie does have sort of a human antagonist. In the movie, there's a scene where Betty and Roger go to see this professor who tells them the legend of the blind dead, and you find out that this professor has a son named Pedro who is part of this gang of smugglers that the police suspect were actually behind Virginia's murder. So Betty and Roger end up roping Pedro and his girlfriend into spending the night with them at these ruins, and like I said, Pedro is basically the human antagonist of the film, because he is an absolute scumbag. He's a misogynist and a bully, and he's also a literal rapist, because there actually is a rape scene in this movie, and I just want to give fair warning to anybody who is uncomfortable or is triggered by depictions of rape in film. There is a scene in this movie where Pedro is alone with Betty and he ends up raping her, and while the scene is not as graphic as rape scenes in movies like The Last House on the Left, I Spit on Your Grave, or even A Clockwork Orange, what makes the scene almost just as horrific is after he rapes her, he offers her a cigarette as if what he did wasn't a big deal. And the scene wasn't just just uncomfortable, but it was also kind of unnecessary as well. Not that horror films can't touch on serious issues, they certainly can, but it all depends on the kind of horror film that you're making. Horror is such a wide genre and goes into so many different subcategories, and there are serious horror films, but then there are horror films that are meant to be just fun, and this, up until that scene, was generally a pretty fun horror film, but then you introduce that scene of just grisly reality into a movie about blind zombies. But again, the scene was totally unnecessary, but at the same time, as fucked up as this is gonna sound, rape was kind of a common trope in a lot of 70s exploitation films. It was basically a go-to thing to show a character as a scumbag. But besides that, I did enjoy Tombs of the Blind Dead quite a bit, and I do recommend this, especially if you like early 70s Euro horror. And this movie has some haunting scenes, especially towards the end, where you see the blind dead make it onto a train, and they just start slaughtering everybody on the train, including children. And the whole train sequence in the movie reminded me of another classic Spanish horror film, Horror Express, which came out the same year as this. And an interesting connection between this and Horror Express, the actress who plays Betty in the movie was actually married to the director of Horror Express. Now, I mentioned before that one of the alternate titles for this film was Revenge from Planet Ape. Apparently, some American distributors, in order to capitalize on the success of Planet of the Apes, they re-edited the film to make the Blind Dead actually these intelligent apes that coexisted with humans thousands of years ago, but the humans wiped them out, and now all these years later they have come back as zombies. I'm not freaking joking. This version of the film I think is now lost, but the DVD I have comes with the opening title sequence of the Revenge from Planet Ape version. Now, the DVD does come with two versions of the film, the original Spanish version and an English edit of the film. Now, the English version cuts out a lot of scenes and it switches scenes around, and I'll be honest, the English version is kind of a mess, so if you watch this movie, try to watch the original Spanish version, as long as you don't mind reading subtitles. Now, Tombs of the Blind Dead kicked off a small franchise. The movie spawned 3 initial sequels, all of which were also directed by Amando de Ossorio. In 1973, you had Return of the Blind Dead, also known as Return of the Evil Dead, no relation to the Sam Raimi film. Then you had The Ghost Galleon, also known as Horror of the Zombies, in 1974, and then you had Night of the Seagulls in 1975. Now, I have all the original Blind Dead movies on this DVD set from Blue Underground. Now, there technically was a 5th Blind Dead movie released in 2021 called Curse of the Blind Dead, but I'm not sure if this is considered to be an official canon sequel or not, because there technically have been other unofficial sequels to the Blind Dead series. For example, there's a film from 2009 called Graveyard of the Dead, which is considered to be an unofficial Blind Dead movie. And going back to the 70s, there was a film called The Devil's Cross, which is sometimes considered to be the unofficial 5th Blind Dead movie. There was a Jess Franco film called Mansion of the Living Dead, which was apparently heavily inspired by the Blind Dead movies. The Blind Dead films, I think, also had an influence on John Carpenter's The Fog. There was a Guy Smith novel called The Wood, and the villains of that book were this zombie cult that worshipped these Lovecraftian beings, and I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they were partly inspired by the Blind Dead. But yeah, that was my review on Tombs of the Blind Dead, also known as The Night of Blind Terror, and my next movie review will be on The Return of the Evil Dead.